December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor burns, and in that moment, the United States military faces a brutal truth. Some of the aircraft sitting on American runways are already obsolete before the first bomb falls. But what you might not know is that within 4 years, American factories would produce not just better planes, but an entire aerial armada so vast and technologically advanced that it would help crush two empires on opposite sides of the globe. This is the story of every single American aircraft that took to the skies in World War II. And some of these machines you've never heard of. Let's start with a plane that had no business being in a modern war, the Boeing P-26 Peashooter. By 1941, this fighter was a relic. Open cockpit, fixed landing gear, the last of its kind in American service. Most nations had moved on to enclosed cockpits and retractable gear years earlier. But here's what happened when the Japanese invaded the Philippines. American pilots, flying these outdated Peashooters, went up anyway. They knew the odds. They knew their planes were slower, less armed, and completely outmatched, and they fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The Peashooter was obsolete the moment the war began, but the men who flew it were not. Now, contrast that with a plane that should have been a winner, but turned into one of the war's greatest disappointments, the Brewster F-2A Buffalo. This was the U.S. Navy's first monoplane fighter. Modern design, enclosed cockpit, retractable gear, everything the Peashooter wasn't. The Navy was proud of it, but when American Buffaloes met Japanese Zeros in the Pacific, the results were catastrophic. The Buffalo was too heavy, too slow, and too clumsy. American pilots called it a flying coffin. But here's where it gets strange. That same aircraft, the one that failed so miserably in American hands, became a legend somewhere else. Finland. Finnish pilots, flying the exact same Buffalo, racked up kill ratios that made it one of the most successful fighters in their entire Air Force. Same plane, different war, different outcome. What changed? Not the machine, the tactics. The Finns used the Buffalo's strengths in a different kind of fight, one that played to its advantages in slower, tighter combat over their frozen forests. The Buffalo's story is a reminder. In war, context is everything. Let me take you to another fighter, one that was rugged, dependable, and became famous for a paint job, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. This wasn't the fastest fighter. It wasn't the most maneuverable, but it could take a beating and keep flying. And in the hands of one particular group of American volunteers, it became legendary, the Flying Tigers. China, 1941. Before Pearl Harbor, before America was officially at war, a group of American pilots were already fighting the Japanese. They flew P-40s, painted with shark mouths on the nose, and they developed a tactic that turned the P-40's weakness into strength. The Warhawk couldn't dogfight a Zero at high altitude. It would lose every time. So the Flying Tigers didn't dogfight, they dove. The P-40 was heavy, and that made it fast in a dive. So they attacked from above, came screaming down at full throttle, fired, and kept going. They never turned to fight. Dive, shoot, escape, over and over, and it worked. Against a technically superior enemy, the Flying Tigers and their shark-mouthed Warhawks became a thorn in Japan's side that they couldn't remove. Sometimes the best plane isn't the fastest or the most advanced. Sometimes it's the one that's tough enough to do the job and survive the doing. Now let's talk about a plane that didn't just survive, it dominated. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat. If the Buffalo was the disappointment, the Hellcat was the redemption. This was the plane designed specifically to kill the Zero, and it did, 19-1. That was the Hellcat's kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. 19 enemy planes destroyed for every Hellcat lost. Think about that number. It means that if you were a Japanese pilot facing a Hellcat, statistically, you were already dead. The Hellcat wasn't the most glamorous fighter. It wasn't the prettiest, but it was engineered with one brutal truth in mind. Carrier pilots needed a plane that was easy to land, hard to kill, and absolutely lethal in combat. Grumman delivered. The Hellcat was tough enough to absorb punishment that would shred other fighters. It had the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, and it had the firepower to tear apart anything it caught in its sights. Navy pilots loved it because it brought them home. By the end of the war, Hellcats had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. The Zero, once the most feared fighter in the Pacific, became prey. The hunted became the hunter, and the Hellcat was the reason why. But if you ask most people to name one American fighter from World War II, they won't say Hellcat. They'll say Mustang, the North American P-51 Mustang. And they're not wrong. The Mustang is arguably the finest piston engine fighter ever built. But here's what most people don't know. The Mustang almost didn't happen, and when it did happen, it almost failed. The British ordered the Mustang in 1940. North American Aviation designed it in just 117 days. When it first flew, it was fast and maneuverable, but it had one fatal flaw. Its American engine was weak at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang was mediocre. And in the skies over Europe, bombers flew at 25,000 feet. The Mustang, as originally designed, couldn't protect them. The Army Air Force lost interest. The Mustang looked like it would be a footnote. Then someone had an idea. What if we put a British engine in this American airframe? The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire. It was a radical suggestion, but they tried it, and everything changed. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang became a completely different aircraft. It was fast at all altitudes. It had the range to fly from England to Berlin and back, something no other fighter could do. And it could outfight anything the Germans put in the sky. Suddenly, American bombers had an escort that could stay with them all the way to the target and all the way home. German fighters, which had been slaughtering unescorted bomber formations, now had to face Mustangs. And the Mustangs were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots who knew they had the better machine. The air war over Europe turned. Some historians argue that the Mustang, more than any other single weapon, won the air campaign against Germany. One aircraft, one engine swap, the difference between defeat and victory. Now let's shift from fighters to bombers, because this is where American industrial might truly showed itself. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, 4 engines, 13 machine guns, a bomb load of 6,000 pounds, and a reputation for being nearly indestructible. Stories of B-17s coming home with entire sections shot away became legend. Tail gunners would watch the bomber next to them explode, then look down at their own shredded aircraft and wonder how they were still flying. But here's the truth behind the legend. The B-17 wasn't indestructible. It just seemed that way because the ones that made it home were the ones people saw. The ones that didn't make it home, the ones that were shot down over Germany, those crews didn't get to tell their story. The B-17's survival rate was actually brutal. In some bomb groups, the odds of a crew completing their required 25 missions were less than 1 in 4. Most crews didn't make it, but the B-17 gave them a chance. And in a war where chance was all you had, that mattered. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was the B-17's partner in the strategic bombing campaign. It wasn't as pretty, it wasn't as beloved, but it was produced in greater numbers than any other American aircraft of the war. More than 18,000 B-24s rolled off the assembly lines. Why? Because it could carry more bombs, fly farther, and was easier to build than the B-17. The Liberator was the workhorse that didn't get the glory, but did the job. And then there was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This wasn't just a bomber. This was a technological leap so far ahead of anything else flying that it felt like science fiction. Pressurized cabin, so crews didn't need oxygen masks, remote-controlled gun turrets, radar bombing systems. The B-29 could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber that came before it. It was also the most expensive weapons project of the entire war, costing more than the Manhattan Project itself. The B-29 was designed for one purpose: to destroy Japan from the air, and it did. The firebombing raids on Japanese cities, carried out by B-29s, killed more people than the atomic bombs. And speaking of the atomic bombs, it was a B-29, the Enola Gay, that dropped the first one on Hiroshima, and another B-29, Boxcar, that dropped the second on Nagasaki. The war ended because of what the B-29 could do. Not just carry the bombs, but reach the targets that no other aircraft could reach. But bombers don't win wars alone. They need escorts, they need ground attack aircraft, and they need pilots who are willing to fly into hell at 200 feet. Enter the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, because it was massive for a single-engine fighter. It weighed as much as some medium bombers, but that weight meant armor, lots of it, and 850 caliber machine guns. The Thunderbolt could take damage that would down any other fighter and keep flying. When the P-47 switched from high-altitude escort to ground attack, it became a terror. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of a Thunderbolt's engine because they knew what came next: rockets, bombs, and a hailstorm of machine gun fire. The Jug was too tough to kill and too heavily armed to survive. Pilots who flew it trusted it completely. In a war where trust in your aircraft meant the difference between life and death, the Thunderbolt earned that trust every single time. Let's talk about a plane with one of the most distinctive silhouettes of the war, the Vought F4U Corsair. That inverted gull-wing design wasn't just for looks, it was functional. The Corsair needed a massive propeller to harness the power of its enormous engine, and that propeller needed ground clearance. The inverted gull-wing solved the problem. The result was one of the fastest, most powerful fighters in the Pacific. But here's the irony. The Corsair was designed for aircraft carriers, but the Navy initially refused to use it on carriers. The long nose blocked the pilot's view during landing, and the Corsair's landing gear tended to bounce on touchdown. Too dangerous for carrier operations, the Navy said. So the Marine Corps took it instead, and the Marines loved it. Flying from land bases in the Pacific, Marine Corsair pilots turned it into a legend. The Japanese called it Whistling Death because of the sound it made in a dive. By the time the Navy finally worked out the carrier landing issues and brought the Corsair aboard, the Marines had already proven what it could do. Now, let's drop down to a different kind of flying: low, slow, and dangerous. The Douglas A-20 Havoc. This light bomber wasn't glamorous, but it was everywhere. The Havoc flew in every theater of the war: Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, the Mediterranean. It was fast for a bomber, maneuverable, and could carry a respectable bomb load. But what made the A-20 special was its versatility. Some were fitted with solid noses, packed with machine guns for ground strafing. Others were converted into night fighters, hunting enemy bombers in the dark. The Havoc didn't have one job, it had every job. And then there's the bomber that became famous for a single, impossible mission: the North American B-25 Mitchell. April 18th, 1942. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America needed something, anything, to prove it could strike back at Japan. Enter Jimmy Doolittle and 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers. The plan was insane: launch fully loaded bombers from an aircraft carrier, something that had never been done with planes that size, fly them 600 miles to Japan, bomb Tokyo, and then keep flying to China because there wasn't enough fuel to return to the carrier. It worked, barely. The Doolittle raid didn't cause significant damage to Japan, but it sent a message: you are not safe. We can reach you. And psychologically, it was a turning point. Americans, reeling from months of defeat, finally had something to cheer about. The Japanese, who believed their home islands were invulnerable, suddenly realized they weren't. And the B-25, the plane that made it possible, became a symbol of American ingenuity and audacity. But not every bomber was a success story. Let's talk about the Martin B-26 Marauder. In the early days, this medium bomber had a terrifying nickname: the Widowmaker. It required a high landing speed, and if a pilot came in too slow, the Marauder would stall and crash. Training accidents piled up. Crews were terrified of it. There was talk of canceling production entirely. But then something changed. Better training, more experience. Pilots learned how to fly the B-26 properly, and when they did, they discovered it was actually one of the toughest, most effective medium bombers of the war. By the end of the conflict, the Marauder had the lowest loss rate of any American bomber in Europe. The plane that was once called the Widowmaker became one of the safest bombers to fly. It just needed pilots who understood it. Let's shift to a type of aircraft most people never think about: patrol bombers and flying boats. The Consolidated PBY Catalina. This slow, ungainly seaplane doesn't look like much, but ask any pilot who ditched in the Pacific and was rescued by a PBY, and they'll tell you it was the most beautiful aircraft ever built. The Catalina's job was everything: reconnaissance, anti-submarine warfare, search and rescue. It flew long, boring patrols over empty ocean, looking for enemy submarines or downed air crews. And when it found someone in the water, it would land in the open ocean, something most planes could never do, and pull them to safety. PBY crews flew missions that lasted 12, sometimes 16 hours. No fighter escorts, no glory, just endless miles of water, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone might need them. Thousands of Allied airmen owed their lives to PBY Catalinas and the crews who flew them into danger to bring them home. And then there were the transports, the aircraft that didn't drop bombs or shoot down enemy planes, but without which the war couldn't have been won. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain. You might know it by its civilian name, the DC-3. General Eisenhower said the C-47 was one of the 4 weapons that won the war in Europe. Not a fighter, not a bomber, a transport. Why? Because wars run on logistics, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, reinforcements. All of it had to get from point A to point B, often under fire. The C-47 did that job. It flew paratroopers into Normandy on D-Day. It supplied surrounded troops at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. It flew the Hump, the treacherous supply route over the Himalayas to China, where weather and mountains killed more airmen than the enemy did. The C-47 was reliable, easy to maintain, and could land on rough airstrips that would destroy other aircraft. Pilots loved it. Ground crews loved it. It wasn't exciting, but it was essential. And in a war that stretched across the entire planet, essential meant everything. Let's talk about a plane that trained the pilots who flew all these combat aircraft, the North American AT-6 Texan. This advanced trainer was where pilots learned to fight. Every Allied fighter pilot, whether they ended up in Mustangs, Thunderbolts, or Spitfires, learned their skills in a Texan. It was demanding enough to weed out pilots who couldn't handle combat aircraft, but forgiving enough that mistakes didn't automatically mean death. The Texan taught dogfighting, gunnery, formation flying, and instrument navigation. It was the bridge between basic trainers and frontline fighters, and it did its job so well that it stayed in service for decades after the war ended. Some pilots said the Texan was harder to fly than the fighters they flew in combat. If you could master the Texan, you could fly anything. Now let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum, the lightest, simplest aircraft in the American arsenal, the Piper L-4 Grasshopper. This was essentially a civilian Piper Cub in military colors. It had no armor, no guns, and a top speed that wouldn't even qualify as fast for a car on a modern highway, but it saved countless lives. The Grasshopper's job was artillery spotting. A pilot and an observer would fly low over enemy lines, radioing back coordinates to artillery batteries. The enemy would shoot at them with everything they had, and the Grasshopper, slow and fragile, would just keep flying. These pilots didn't have the glory of fighter aces or the prestige of bomber crews, but infantry soldiers on the ground loved them because accurate artillery support meant the difference between being overrun and holding the line. Grasshopper pilots also evacuated wounded soldiers from frontline positions, landing in tiny clearings under fire, loading a wounded man and taking off again before the enemy could zero in. No ejection seat, no parachute usually, because there wasn't room. Just skill, courage, and a tiny fabric-covered aircraft that somehow kept flying. Let's turn to something most people never heard of, military gliders, the Waco CG-4 Hadrian. Imagine being a soldier in World War II, and your commanding officer tells you that for the next mission, you'll be flying into combat in an aircraft with no engine. The glider would be towed behind a transport, released near the landing zone, and glide silently down to Earth. No power, no ability to maneuver if something went wrong, just physics and hope. That was the reality for airborne troops who flew in gliders. The CG-4 could carry 15 fully equipped soldiers or a jeep with a small artillery piece. On D-Day, hundreds of gliders landed in Normandy, delivering troops and equipment directly to the battlefield. Some landings were perfect, others ended in crashes. Broken gliders scattered across fields, but the troops got to the objective, and that was what mattered. Glider pilots were among the bravest men in the war. They flew into combat with no way to defend themselves, no engine to escape danger, and the knowledge that once they landed, they were infantrymen until they could link up with friendly forces or get killed trying. Many didn't make it, but the ones who did made airborne operations possible. Now, let's talk about something that seems almost impossible for the 1940s, helicopters. The Sikorsky R-4 Hoverfly was the world's first mass-produced helicopter. It was slow, limited in range, and could barely carry 2 people, but it proved that rotary wing flight was possible and practical. The R-4 flew rescue missions in Burma, landing in jungle clearings where no fixed-wing aircraft could go, picking up downed pilots and flying them to safety. This was the infancy of helicopter warfare. The technology was crude, the machines unreliable, but everyone who saw the R-4 in action understood that this was the future. Vertical takeoff and landing, the ability to hover, access to terrain no other aircraft could reach. The R-4 was primitive, but it was a glimpse of what would come decades later. The helicopter gunships and medevac birds of Vietnam, the Black Hawks of modern warfare. It all started here, with a tiny, fragile machine that proved the impossible was possible. Finally, let's end with something truly strange. Drones. Yes, drones in World War II. The Culver PQ-8 and PQ-14 were radio-controlled target drones used to train anti-aircraft gunners. But more interesting was the Interstate TDR, an early assault drone. This was a primitive flying bomb, packed with explosives and guided by radio control toward heavily defended targets. The idea was to send these expendable aircraft into situations too dangerous for manned bombers. The TDR saw limited use against Japanese positions in the Pacific. The technology was crude, the reliability poor, but the concept was sound. 80 years later, we live in a world where drones are everywhere, from combat zones to civilian airspace. The TDR and its cousins were the ancestors of modern unmanned warfare. They didn't change World War II, but they hinted at how future wars would be fought. So, what does all this mean? Over 1,900 different aircraft types and variants served the United States in World War II. Some were legendary, some were failures. Many were workhorses that did their jobs without fanfare or fame, but together they represented something unprecedented in human history, an entire nation's industrial power focused on a single goal. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year. Think about that scale. Every single day, hundreds of new planes rolled off assembly lines. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers. The skies filled with American aircraft, and the enemies of the United States learned that they couldn't match that production, that innovation, that relentless aerial onslaught. Every aircraft in this story, from the obsolete P-26 pea shooter to the atomic bomb-carrying B-29 Superfortress, played a part. Some parts were small, some were decisive, but all of them mattered, because wars aren't won by single heroes or single weapons. They're won by the accumulated effort of millions of people, building, flying, and fighting with the tools they have. The men who flew these aircraft knew the odds. They knew that every mission might be their last, but they went anyway. And the machines they flew, some brilliant, some flawed, all of them pushed to their limits, carried them into history. This was the American Air War. This was every plane that fought it, and this is their story.